Okay, so then as we discussed, our idea now is to talk about the discussion. And as we did last week, the idea is to discuss the structure of how you should think the discussion, and not necessarily guide you on what to write about, but really the structure. Convening back a little bit, what I mean by that is when you're writing a text, a text is not just a sequence of thoughts, of sequence of events. You structure the text so that every piece of the text has a meaning, has a role to play in the writing, and in building the narrative. In the introduction, you have specific roles. In the methods is a little clearer because we are guided to write the methods with specific subheadings. But if you were to write the methods at a full narrative text, every part of the methods would also have a role. So you have the area where you talk about the study design, the area you talk about the population, the area you talk about data collection. Now, the introduction also has a structure, and the discussion also has a structure. And the structure, again, meaning the roles of each paragraph in that section, it's something that I think is pretty universal across different fields. So you don't have to have a specific template for biomedical sciences, for geography sciences, for psychology sciences. The structure is kind of a-theoretical. I guess there might be some differences when you're writing a more humanities-based document, but then you also wouldn't write a paper out of, I don't know, anthropology. You might, but they have different structures that are appropriate to their field. But we come from the global health, the biomedical health, the health sciences, health allied sciences. So this works kind of across the board. Okay, so the discussion, the concept of a discussion is to reiterate the results and then provide a conversation between the results and the literature that will both justify the hypothesis and explain the hypothesis. That's what we're trying to do with the discussion. And then we're also trying to show what we believe are the next steps, or what are the implications of our study. So every time we're building a discussion, there's a few structures that we want to focus on. And very similar to the introduction, we're going to center the discussion into paragraphs, and each paragraph meanings. But the first paragraph, so let's assume you're going to write up your discussion. This is your discussion template. So you would copy this and paste in your paper. And then you would start outlining your discussion based on these key concepts. The first paragraph, so let's make this one paragraph of the discussion, is the paragraph where you will highlight the uniqueness and summary of the main findings of the paper. So there's two concepts here, uniqueness and a summary. And the way you do this is you will start the discussion by highlighting why your study and your results are very unique, are very different. Now, if you remember correctly, the uniqueness of a paper is also highlighted in the gap of the introduction. So the gap of the introduction is what highlights the gap in the literature, which is also the uniqueness of your finding. So for me, what I do is the first paragraph of the introduction is usually something that I've written based on the gap of my paper. So you start by stating the uniqueness, importance of your paper. And for me, I always like to make this a translation of the gap, using a translation of the gap. Then once you highlighted the importance and the uniqueness, you just called back the gap. You called back the objective. It could be either the gap or the objective, because by now we know we're writing them with the same words or the same meaning. Once you come back to this is what we tried to do. Now, these are the things we found. That's the second sentence. So the first sentence, I'm like that. The first sentence is going to be a statement of the uniqueness. The second sentence is going to be a summary of the results. In the summary of the results, there's something that Catherine taught me that I really like. And it resounds this idea that we are only able to really grasp three things in our heads at the same time. It's a lot harder for you to try to discuss in the same text more than three ideas. That's something that Catherine taught me that I think is very important. And we started adding that to our discussion structure, which then whenever you summarize your results, what you're doing is you're using the 3 main points concept. What is the 3 main points concept? You will summarize all the results you've presented into 3 key sentences, 3 key results. Yeah, but I found other things that are important. They are important, but they are less important, or they need to be cluttered into these 3 key results. Okay? And so when you're writing that, you're basically going to write a statement that says, to answer our gap, we observed that result A, we also observed result B, and result C. This is very easy for me to follow because every time I wrote a project when I was training and today when I'm writing grants, I always try to write 3 goals. And there's usually how we organize the results section of a paper. When you think about this, when you think about our 4 meetings concept, you're always going to have a table 1 with social demographic data. You're going to have a table 2 that looks into the social demographic data broken down by an outcome or something like that. And then you're going to have table 3, which is usually the multivariable model that answers your question. And those are the 3 main results. The distribution of the population is a result. This secondary analysis where you're kind of showing the outcome information, the distribution of the outcome by some confounders is a second result. And then the third result is the association, the coefficient you're trying to find. So you're always trying to build the results into this growing cascade of data that tells the story in a progressive way. So the results, when you're finding the 3 main concepts, you're also going to find the 3 main concepts into showing what is the result A, B, and C, and they're kind of progressing. The main key messages you want the reviewer to see. And when you're talking about the main key messages the reviewer wants to see, you have to think about what are the 3 take-home messages that we want someone to take from the paper. You summarize them in your discussion. So you use the 3 main points, which I think are great. And then you center all of your writing on these 3 main results. This is one of the reasons why our last check-in meeting before a paper is finished is a meeting where the analysis is done, the models are complete, and we're going to sit down with the group and we're going to go through discussion points. The discussion points are the 3 main discussion points that will guide the writing in the discussion. Any questions? Nope. Okay. So then reading here what we have on the template, for the first instance, you're going to state the uniqueness and importance of the paper. And then here I added using a translation of the gap. So focus on the gap. State how the manuscript is unique compared to the remaining literature, starting with a hedging sentence such as, to the best of our knowledge, this is the first report to, or something that kind of highlights that this is the first time this has been analyzed, reinforcing the originality of the findings and how they will increase the contribution to the literature. And then here there's importance that we want to hedge this somehow. So that's how the template talks about to the best of our knowledge. And this wording here, Catherine and I don't like that very much. This is what we used to use with the group that I worked here before, to say to the best of our knowledge is a statement that if somebody says, well, you didn't look at this other person, we are already hedging ourselves saying to the best of what I could find, right? But we can use other kinds of hedgings, that's fine. But we do want to highlight if this is the first report, of this is the whatever is the uniqueness of the study, because we want it to shine. We want it to be out to draw attention to it. Then whenever we use the three main points, this is when we summarize the main three. Let's take 3 findings of the paper. And then this is the catch. They're going to serve as the summary of your results and prepare the readers to the discussion. And I like the comment here that this is basically this is the sentence where we're going to say, this is what we're going to talk about here. So you've read this introduction, you've read this paper, you've read these results. Now in the discussion, these are the 3 key things we're going to talk about that we want you to follow. And then here are some examples that we can look for. Then the next 3 paragraphs in the discussion are pretty straightforward. If I just highlighted that what we're trying to do with the discussion is identify the uniqueness and then identify the 3 main points, then what we're going to have is we're going to have 1 paragraph per point. So here is discussion of causal mechanisms and counter arguments in relation to the results. 1 paragraph per main point. So this basically means that we're going to, let me go back. We're going to write 1 paragraph per main point, meaning that we're going to have at minimum 3 paragraphs. 1 per key point, 1 per main point. And then each of these paragraphs are supposed to discuss the causal mechanisms of what we found and any counter arguments of what we found. So the way I like to organize this in my head is that for each of the 3 main points, you should provide evidence of the result concordance or disagreement with the literature, contextualizing how these results compare to similar settings, populations, or interventions. So here, let's say that I found that the PPK intervention, an intervention to reduce alcohol use, is effective to reduce binge drinking. So that's my first result. The first result is patients enrolled in the intervention showed, in average, 2 less days of binge drinking per month compared to patients that didn't receive the intervention. That's our key result. Now, in the discussion, what I want to do is I want to show how is this in concordance or in disagreement. Let me change agreement here. Agreement. Or in disagreement with the literature. So other studies that did the same kind of intervention, did they find similar results or not? The uniqueness of our study is that our study is the first study that ever done this in Africa, or that has ever done this intervention in the emergency department in the low-income country. Well, if this is the uniqueness, it means that I'm never going to have another paper to compare from the low and middle income world, but I am going to have papers to compare in the high income world. So did the result in the low income world compare to the results in the high income world? So that's comparing settings. Is it in agreement or is it in disagreement? And I have to show the references for. Now, I can also compare populations. So we did our intervention with emergency medicine patients. Where was the similar intervention done in other populations? Now, for my example, I know that this intervention has been done in primary care settings, which is very different from emergency medicine. So how did it compare? Oh, the literature has shown that in primary care settings, the results are not significant, or there wasn't a significant improvement in control group versus the intervention group. That's different from what we found. That's an important discussion to make. And then finally, compare interventions. So we did a brief intervention followed a negotiational interview. What kind of other brief interventions exist, and how did our compares to the others? Okay. Once you identify the results that are in agreement or in disagreement, this is where you either discuss the causal mechanisms for the results, if in agreement, or discuss the explanation for the disagreement, which are the counter arguments. So now, if my results have similar results to the ones found in high-income countries, then I can add a small discussion to say, why do I think this worked here? And then this is where we're going to pull some data to say a BNI, an intervention based on brief negotiational interview, has a potential to affect because it acts in a moment of a teachable moment, and you kind of explain the causal mechanism there. Now, when I compare this to primary care settings, and I say that the ED intervention, the emergency medicine department-based intervention, had a benefit, had a significant association, and a primary care didn't, this is where I have to bring some information to explain why it didn't in the primary care setting and why it did in the emergency department. And so here I need to go and pull some data from behavioral change theories and argue that in the emergency department, one possible explanation is that the traumatic experience of injury could foster the teachable moment in the patient, while at the primary care setting, the teachable moment is not as prominent, and that could reduce the impact of a behavioral change intervention. So I'm providing both the comparison to the literature as much as I'm providing the explanation to why I think those results worked and didn't work. Yes, Cyrus?
When you're citing another paper's discussion, do you cite just the results they found in their manuscript, or can you sometimes cite that explanation or insight or discussion too?
Yeah, I think you can cite the discussion. I would just invite you to bring that to the discussion text. So I would say if I want to write, let's say that I found a similar result to someone and I want to highlight what they discussed, I could potentially write up and say, these results have been hypothesized to be linked to these causal mechanisms, and then you cite the paper. But then the idea is that if you should probably have some sort of raw data or theory to support that rationale. And then you should also cite that.
Sure.
Okay. Yeah. That's kind of how, and what you do is, if you're trying to come up with a new hypothesis that your paper have generated, and you don't have particular information about the hypothesis, you can find data that supports the hypothesis on the around that.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. And so here then we continue. I'm going to keep this. And then it says, in relation to causal mechanisms, as an example, you might want to talk about the pathophysiological mechanisms or social mechanisms that led to the results converging at the common point. Then approach the previous results of literature that disagree with your causal statements, and then provide explanations to why the disagreement occurred. Disagreements are usually related to different research methodologies or different patient characteristics. So it's easy to show a disagreement based on population, intervention, setting. And then there's a suggestion here, whenever you meet a contradiction, make a distinction. That's an interesting one. Cool. And then here's some examples of that. But so you're going to write examples of how people wrote both contradictions and similarities. So then you're going to have one paragraph by main result. So see how important is that the statement of the summary of the results really guide the direction of the discussion. And the reader now, as soon as they start reading the results, are already going to know what they're going to read about. And when they look at the next paragraph, they're not going to be lost. And what is it that he's talking about? I know that they're talking about point A. I know they're going to talk about point B. I know they're going to talk about point C. And that gives me structure to read. It reduces the anxiety in reading. And it also centers the reviewer on that concept we're trying to discuss. Now, once you've done that, you're going to have one additional paragraph to discuss study limitations and hedging statements. This is extremely important. I think that this is probably the most important paragraph in the entire discussion, because this is the area where you will acknowledge your limitations and you're going to provide justification to your limitations. This is the section that whenever your study has a big weakness, you should address the weakness here in a way that you convince the reviewer that the weakness is not biasing your results. If you do a good job here, your likelihood of getting your paper accepted increases a lot, because any weaknesses are already discussed in this section. So study limitations are usually going to be those things that you had to make a methodological decision. And the decisions, as we like to say in psychology, every choice means choosing something and not choosing all the other possibilities. When we do that methodologically, it's the same. So if I decide to do a cross-sectional study, it means that I chose not to do a cohort, a case control, a clinical trial. And I might need to explain why I did that if that's a limitation. The study design is not necessarily a limitation, but how you address it, it's a limitation. So if you did a cross-sectional study, it probably means that you're not going to be able to do causal inference. And if you are going to do causal inference, then here is where you have to address why you think you can do causal inference on a cross-sectional study. If you did a randomized clinical trial, but you could not do blinding, then this is the section where you're going to explain why you didn't do blinding and why you believe that your blinding didn't bias your results, or what attempts you did to make the results you find less biased. For me, the main things we discuss on study limitations are usually sample size, but the majority of the papers I read, they don't really discuss sample size. They just say, a potential limitation of my study is my sample size, period. And now, yes, thank you. What are you going to tell me that are going to make me feel like I can read your results and take your results as they are supposed to be taken, or are you just biased? How did you address that? Usually what we have to say is, while population is a study limitation, this is the only available population, and we did report the appropriate confidence intervals to show the variation of our estimates. Okay? You have to make some sort of hedging statement. A hedging statement, it's a statement that protects you, that tells you, what did I do? Or tells you, why do I think this limitation is not going to bias or weaken my paper to a point that my assumptions are not going to be true, or that I can't take my assumptions to the face value. So what you want to do is you want to point the main limitations, and then you want to hedge the text, stating what you have done to minimize those. And I love the comments. I'm thinking this was Ashley. I'm not sure if it was someone else, but I agree that this can be merged with the concluding statement. So yes, it could be merged with the ending statement if you don't have a lot of limitations to share. Sometimes you are going to have limitations and you want to give it enough space. So that's why I suggest you'll have a full paragraph for it. And yes, I agree. You always have limitations. If you don't write about a limitation, you're wrong. That's your own limitation. Acknowledge your flaws, talk about them, accept them, and face them. Right? That's the basics of everything. So once you've done that, limitations, then you come to the last paragraph. And this is the future research and implications to practice. And here I'm going to have to clean this up because I want to reduce these references to RAR here. But yeah, but here is where you are going to get your results and say, forward, we believe that the science should be focused on understanding these areas that we haven't studied, but these are the hypotheses that we've generated. Usually what we write here are the things that we want to do so that people know we're thinking about it. And there are things that we will write a grant on so that the paper creates the narrative for the grant we want to write on. And then you have implications for practice. And this is the statement where you really say, this is how my results translate to real life. This is how we believe our results are going to change practice some way. And this is the only paragraph, or not the only, but this is the paragraph where you're probably going to be able to put yourself out more in the paper. This is where you are able to put more of your opinions, more of your guidance to what you think the next steps are in that field of science. And I'll tell you, a lot of the students look at this paragraph to find gaps for their own research. At least that's what I teach my students, to go find papers, look at their discussions, and look at what directions the researchers believe are important to follow so that you can then create your own gap. Okay? Cool. So here, there's a few bullet points of common mistakes, and we can open up the room to see if we can think about a few more. The first one here is authors discuss results that do not exist in their study. Yes, please do not do that. Somebody else found a result that has nothing to do with your study. Please don't do that. The mechanisms underlying the results are not discussed, and only the authors agreeing and disagreeing are discussed. So if you provide data to show how your results compare, you always want to show why they compare, why they agree, or you always want to explain why they disagree. There's always has to be some sort of rationale. If you don't know, then you probably need to do more literature review. Another common mistake I'm going to put here is what Cyrus had alluded to, is authors use arguments made on introductions, discussions to compare instead of citing the actual data. This is a big limitation, a big mistake. Another big mistake is discussing in large length results that are secondary or that are not key to the paper. So I've had papers where the paper was about a machine learning model accuracy, and there were 2 paragraphs in the discussion comparing the population demographics to the literature, which makes no sense. What other mistakes in discussion writing do you think we should talk about? Or are there questions around the structure of discussion writing? Nothing? Okay, well, I can't stress how important this structure is. The discussion is usually a phase where the authors are tired of the study and they don't have the breath to fully dedicate their attention to writing it up in high quality. So it's usually very bad. Following the structure will help you put direction to it and will help reviewers understand what you're trying to talk about. So I really strongly suggest you guys think about this, and we can improve this template as we go in writing about. Okay, that's what I had. I'm gonna stop recording.